Long before drive-thrus and food trucks, ancient Rome had its own version of fast food, the Thermopolia. These bustling street-side stalls served hot soups, stews, bread, and wine to the working poor who lacked kitchens at home. With large stone counters embedded with terracotta jars, vendors dished out ready-to-eat meals to passers-by. Quick, cheap, and satisfying. The aroma of grilled meats and spiced vegetables filled the air, drawing crowds into lively corners of the city. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of these eateries, complete with frescoed menus and food remnants. More than just places to eat, Thermopolia were social hubs, proof that the craving for street food is as old as civilization itself. To walk through the streets of ancient Rome was to be immersed in a city of contradictions. Marble temples gleamed above narrow alleys, senators paraded in togas while slaves hurried with baskets. Aqueducts brought water from miles away, while tenement blocks crumbled from neglect. Beneath the grandeur of empire lay a daily struggle that defined the lives of millions, the struggle for food. Rome was a city of appetites, its population swollen by migrants, freedmen, laborers, and slaves who crowded into insulae, apartment blocks often without kitchens. For the poor and working classes, preparing meals at home was a luxury few could afford. Instead, hunger drove them into the streets, where a peculiar institution arose to meet their needs: the Thermopolium, the Roman fast food stall. The word Thermopolium derives from the Greek for a place where hot things are sold. It described establishments that offered ready-to-eat foods, often simple stews, soups, bread, and wine. In Rome's teeming neighborhoods, hundreds of these stalls lined the streets, their counters facing outward to serve passers-by. Large jars called dolia were sunk into stone counters, keeping food warm or cool, much like the display cases of modern street vendors. To the hungry masses, these stalls were lifelines, cheap, accessible, and abundant. To grasp the significance of the Thermopolia, one must understand the nature of Roman urban life. Archaeological evidence suggests that as many as 90% of Rome's population lived in an island without private kitchens. Fires, space constraints, and poverty made cooking impractical. Instead, daily meals were bought outside. Bread could be purchased from bakeries, wine from taverns, and hot food from the Thermopolia. For the poor, eating was a public act, woven into the fabric of the city itself. The stalls offered a menu both humble and varied. Stews of lentils, beans, or chickpeas simmered in earthen jars. Barley porridge was ladled into bowls. Cheap cuts of meat, sausages, offal, or salted fish were served with bread. Wine was sold watered down, often spiced or sweetened with honey. Archaeologists in Pompeii have uncovered painted frescoes on Thermopolia walls depicting ducks, chickens, and jars of wine, suggesting the range of foods available. The meals were not luxurious, but they were filling, affordable, and social. To step into a Thermopolium was to step into the pulse of Roman street life. Workers crowded the counters at midday, laborers gulped wine before returning to toil, and gossip flowed alongside soup. In a society stratified by wealth and class, the stalls were equalizers of a sort. The poor gathered here not in villas but in public, forging community through necessity. For Rome's elite, who dined lavishly in triclinium dining halls, the Thermopolia represented the gritty underbelly of the city. But for the masses, they were daily sustenance. The archaeological record offers vivid glimpses of these establishments. In Pompeii alone, more than 150 Thermopolia have been uncovered, many with intact counters, painted decorations, and food storage jars. One extraordinary find in 2020 revealed a stall decorated with bright frescoes of a rooster and a dog, its counter still holding remnants of duck bones, piglets, fish, and snails. Traces of wine and beans were discovered, testifying to the flavors of ancient fast food. These stalls, frozen in time by volcanic ash, are time capsules of daily life, more revealing of the ordinary Roman than the grand forums or temples. Yet, the Thermopolia were more than mere eateries. They reflected the economic and social realities of the empire. For the poor, they were essential. For innkeepers and stall owners, they were livelihoods. They also reveal the precariousness of urban survival. Prices fluctuated with grain supplies, which depended on shipments from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt. A shortage could spark riots, sending angry crowds to both bakeries and Thermopolia demanding bread. The politics of the empire, wars, taxes, corruption, played out at the level of the food stall, where the poor felt their effects most keenly. Roman writers sometimes looked down upon the Thermopolia. The satirist Juvenal mocked those who crowded taverns and stalls, painting them as vulgar, unrefined, and morally suspect. To elites, dining outside was a sign of poverty, a mark of those excluded from the luxuries of home-cooked banquets. Yet the disdain of the wealthy only underscores the importance of the stalls. They were the restaurants of the common people, places where necessity outweighed reputation. The existence of Thermopolia also challenges modern assumptions about Roman society. Too often, history is told through emperors, generals, and senators, as if Rome were only marble palaces and triumphal arches. But in the shadows of those monuments, ordinary citizens lived lives structured by the rhythms of hunger and survival. The fast food stall is a reminder that empires are built not only on conquests, but on kitchens, or the lack thereof. The similarity to modern street food is striking. Today, across the world, from the food stalls of Bangkok to the taquerias of Mexico City, millions eat daily meals outside their homes. Street food is affordable, social, and adaptable, just as the Thermopolia were in Rome. When we line up for kebabs, dumplings, or hot dogs, we stand in a line stretching back to Roman counters of stone, where soup simmered and wine was poured for the working poor. Thus, the story of the Thermopolia is not merely about ancient diet, but about the continuity of human need. Hunger is timeless, and so too is the ingenuity of feeding it. Rome's poor turned necessity into culture, creating a form of street dining that survives in spirit today. The fast food stall, far from trivial, is a window into the daily resilience of people who lived not in marble villas, but in cramped apartments, who found warmth and sustenance not in banquets, but in bowls served over a counter. As we step further into this saga, we will see how these stalls were woven into every facet of Roman life: economy, culture, politics, and even morality. Each chapter will peel back another layer: what was eaten, who cooked, how stalls shaped community, how they symbolized both survival and stigma. The Thermopolia, humble yet vital, will guide us through the lived reality of Rome, where hunger met ingenuity in the most human of ways. To understand the Thermopolia is to walk through their streets, to trace fingers over their counters of volcanic stone, to peer into the great jars sunk into masonry, and to imagine the sense of hot stews and sour wine wafting into the air. For while these stalls fed the poor of Rome and her provinces, they were also architectural marvels in miniature, efficient, practical, and deeply adapted to the pulse of urban life. Their very design reveals how Rome's working class lived, how space was used in crowded cities, and how necessity shaped form. The Thermopolium was not an elaborate building. Most were modest establishments set into the ground floors of insulae, the towering apartment blocks where the urban poor lived. Archaeological finds from Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Ostia provide the clearest images: narrow rooms opening directly onto the street, their facades often decorated with painted signs or frescoes advertising food. The stall's heart was the counter, usually built of brick or stone, faced with marble or plaster, and designed to catch the eye of passers-by. Into this counter were set the great earthen jars known as dolia. These jars, sunk deep into the masonry, kept food at temperature, some for hot stews, others for cool wine or olives. The counter thus functioned much like a modern buffet, displaying food openly and inviting the hungry to step closer. Behind the counter, space was tight. A hearth or brazier provided heat for cooking, while shelves held utensils, cups, or amphorae of wine. Often, the back room doubled as storage or living quarters for the proprietor. Unlike the grand kitchens of Roman villas with their bronze cauldrons and slaves tending to elaborate recipes, the Thermopolium was pared down to essentials. Its architecture was not about luxury, but speed, efficiency, and visibility. The layout of these stalls reveals how deeply they were woven into the life of the street. Many opened directly onto busy thoroughfares or market squares, ensuring constant foot traffic. Some were placed near public baths, theaters, or crossroads where workers and travelers gathered. In Pompeii, Archaeologists have mapped Thermopolia clustered around the Forum and main streets, suggesting that they catered to the city's social and commercial hubs. To step into one was less a retreat and more an extension of the street itself. The counter became a threshold where private hunger met public life. Decoration played its part. Frescoes adorned walls, depicting foods for sale, fish, ducks, loaves of bread, or mythological scenes that added atmosphere. In one remarkable example, a thermopolium in Pompeii unearthed in 2020 displayed a fresco of a rooster and a guard dog, images both decorative and symbolic, perhaps signaling protection or prosperity. Such images were both advertisement and identity, transforming bare walls into menus written in color and image rather than words. For a largely illiterate population, these paintings spoke louder than inscriptions. The dolia themselves are perhaps the most striking architectural feature. These massive ceramic jars, with wide mouths and rounded bodies, were set flush with the counter surface. Food was ladled directly from them into bowls or cups. Some jars show traces of carbonization, evidence of hot stews or soups. Others contain residues of beans, grains, or even seafood. In one case, analysis revealed traces of duck bones, piglets, and snails, offering a tantalizing menu of ancient fast food. The design was ingenious. Embedding jars into counters saved space, stabilized them, and made service quick. Customers could see, smell, and select their food immediately. Architecture also shaped atmosphere. Many thermopolia were small, designed for standing customers rather than seated dining. They were places of transience, where workers grabbed a quick meal on the way to labor or home. A few larger establishments included benches or side rooms, where patrons might linger over wine or conversation. But the majority were intimate, bustling, open to the air. Steam from hot jars mingled with the dust of streets. Voices rose in chatter, and the smells of garlic, onions, and herbs spilled into alleys. The positioning of stalls within urban landscapes also reveals the social geography of Rome. The wealthy ate in private villas. The middling classes might dine in capponi, inns or taverns with lodging, but the poor relied on thermopolia. This hierarchy was reflected spatially. Stalls flourished in working-class districts, near insulae, markets, and intersections where ordinary people lived and moved. In Pompeii, richer residential streets had fewer stalls, while crowded neighborhoods teemed with them. Urban planning and architecture thus mirrored social class. The poor ate publicly, their meals framed by stone counters rather than dining rooms. What makes the Thermopolia extraordinary is not only their practicality, but their endurance. Unlike villas, which belonged to the few, stalls were ubiquitous, woven into the everyday city. They reveal a Rome not of emperors and generals, but of bakers, cooks, servers, and customers. Their architecture was not monumental, but lived, shaped by daily necessity. And yet, they also reveal paradox. Roman elites often sneered at Thermopolia, associating them with drunkenness, disorder, and crime. The historian Seneca condemned taverns as dens of vice, while Juvenal mocked those who spent their lives in smoky stalls. But disdain could not erase reality. Archaeology shows that Thermopolia flourished, integrated into urban fabric, essential to survival. The elite may have scorned them, but the poor needed them, and the streets thrived because of them. In a sense, the architecture of the Thermopolium embodies the essence of Rome itself: pragmatic, adaptable, layered. It was not beautiful in the way of temples, but it was functional. It did not glorify power, but it sustained it by feeding the city's workers. And it reminds us that behind every marble arch and aqueduct lay 1,000 humble stalls where food simmered and lives intersected. When we compare the Thermopolia to modern street food stalls, the parallels are uncanny. Counters facing streets, pots of soup or curry or stew kept warm, quick service, bright decoration, the mingling of people from every background. It is a pattern repeated across centuries. From the noodle shops of Hanoi to the taco stands of Mexico City, the architecture of the street stall remains remarkably consistent. The Roman Thermopolia stand as ancestors of this enduring form. Thus, the streets of steam teach us something profound: that architecture is not always about monuments or palaces, but about survival. The design of the Thermopolia was dictated by hunger, space, and community. In their stone counters and sunken jars, we glimpse the ingenuity of ordinary Romans, who found in modest architecture the means to feed millions. As we move forward, we will step beyond walls and counters into the lives of those who ran these stalls, the cooks, servers, and owners who transformed architecture into livelihood. If Chapter 2 has revealed the frame, Chapter 3 will reveal the faces, the human actors who stirred the pots and poured the wine, the entrepreneurs and laborers who built Rome's fast food culture one bowl at a time. Stones and jars give us the framework of the Thermopolia, but it was human hands that animated them. Behind every counter stood a cook stirring pots of stew, a server ladling wine, an owner counting coins. If the architecture of the stalls reveals Rome's ingenuity, then the people who ran them reveal Rome's soul, resourceful, resilient, caught between survival and ambition. Their lives, though largely absent from the grand histories written by senators, are etched into the potsherds and graffiti that survive, offering us fleeting glimpses of the human drama behind the steam. The majority of those who worked in Thermopolia were not wealthy citizens, but freedmen, slaves, or immigrants. For slaves, tending a stall could be both drudgery and opportunity. A slave cook might stand for hours in heat and smoke, stirring lentil soup or grilling sausages for impatient customers. Yet in Rome's complex economy, slaves sometimes managed businesses on behalf of their masters, entrusted with collecting revenue and negotiating sales. For some, this responsibility could be a step toward manumissio, freedom purchased through years of service. Thus, even the humble act of selling wine at a counter could carry the faint glimmer of hope. Freedmen, often former slaves who had bought or been granted liberty, formed the backbone of Rome's entrepreneurial class. Many lacked land or inheritance, but they possessed experience, networks, and ambition. Running a thermopolium offered a steady, if modest, livelihood. The work was grueling, rising early to prepare stews, haggling with suppliers in the market, serving a stream of hungry laborers, then cleaning, restocking, and guarding against theft. Yet for freedmen, it meant independence. Their stalls, humble though they were, gave them status in communities where survival itself was achievement. Women also played roles in these establishments, though Roman writers often cast them in shadow. Inscriptions and graffiti sometimes mention female innkeepers, coponi, suggesting that widows or freed women managed stalls. In taverns, women sometimes served wine, sang, or even provided companionship, blurring the line between food service and entertainment. Elites condemned such women as immoral, but these judgments reveal more about class prejudice than reality. For many poor women, working in or managing a stall was one of few available livelihoods. Their hands, no less than men's, ladled soup and collected coins, feeding Rome one bowl at a time. The daily labor of the Thermopolia was relentless. At dawn, owners and workers went to markets to purchase ingredients, vegetables, beans, salted fish, offal. They bargained with merchants, often haggling fiercely, for margins were thin. By mid-morning, pots bubbled, bread was stacked, and wine diluted. The busiest hours came at midday, when laborers crowded in for a quick meal. Servers had to work quickly, scooping stew into bowls, slicing bread, pouring wine into cups of wood or clay. Noise filled the stalls, clatter of spoons, shouts of orders, laughter, curses, arguments over prices. At night, the pace slowed, but drinkers lingered, turning the stall into a kind of tavern. Roman literature, though disdainful, offers glimpses of these workers. Horace and Juvenal mock innkeepers for cheating customers with watered wine or stale bread. Martial, with his biting wit, described taverns as places of swindlers and quarrels. Such stereotypes, though exaggerated, suggest the precariousness of stallkeepers' reputations. They lived on the margins of respectability, accused of dishonesty, yet indispensable to the urban poor. Customers might complain, but they returned daily, for hunger left little choice. Graffiti in Pompeii speaks in the voices of these workers and their customers. One wall reads, "At niches, hot drinks for a coin." Another advertises, "Best wine here, for 1 coin. Better wine, for 2. Falernian, for 4. These inscriptions remind us that stallkeepers were marketers, skilled in attracting customers with clever pricing. Even in antiquity, fast food culture relied on branding and choice. What emerges is a portrait of resilience. The cooks and servers of the Thermopolia worked in conditions that elite authors scorned, yet their labor sustained Rome. Without them, the poor could not eat, and the city itself could not function. The grandeur of empire, its aqueducts, baths, theaters, rested on the backs of workers who fueled themselves at these counters. The hands that stirred bean stews were, in their own way, the hands that built Rome. At the same time, stallkeepers lived precariously. Fires were common in Insulae, and a single blaze could destroy a stall. Taxes or bribes to officials ate into profits. Moral suspicion from elites cast them as shady or corrupt, and always hunger-pressed. Prices of grain rose and fell with harvests and politics, leaving stallkeepers to balance survival between profit and customer need. To own or run a thermopolium was to live at the mercy of forces far larger than one's counter. Yet we must not imagine only struggle. There was also pride. A successful stallkeeper, known in the neighborhood, could become a figure of familiarity and trust. Customers returned not only for food, but for connection. Jokes were shared, gossip exchanged, friendships formed. In this sense, the Thermopolia were not just workplaces, but social hubs, animated by the personalities of those behind the counter. The human story of the Thermopolia also reminds us of continuity across time. Today, when we buy street food from vendors in carts, stalls, or kiosks, we often interact with small-scale entrepreneurs, immigrants, women, families surviving through labor. Their struggles with long hours, low margins, and suspicion from elites echo those of Roman stallkeepers 2 millennia ago. The hands are different, but the gestures, the ladle, the smile, the exchange of coins, remain the same. Thus, in the steam of the Thermopolia we glimpse not only the architecture of Rome, but the humanity that sustained it. Cooks, servers, and stallkeepers stand as unsung figures of empire, forgotten by history books yet immortalized in the very act of feeding. Their lives tell us that civilizations are built not only by emperors and generals, but by those who stand at counters, serving bowls of soup to the hungry. In the next chapter, we will turn from the people who ran these stalls to the people who crowded them, the customers. Who ate at Thermopolia? What did their presence say about class, poverty, and the rhythms of Roman life? If Chapter 3 has shown us the hands that fed, Chapter 4 will show us the mouths that ate, and in doing so, reveal the social drama of Rome's street food culture. If the Thermopolia were the hands of Rome's working class, feeding the city with hot soups, bread, and cheap wine, then the crowds that filled them were its heartbeat. To understand these stalls is not only to see their counters and cooks, but to imagine the hungry faces that leaned across stone ledges, coins in hand, waiting for a bowl of stew. These customers, poor, transient, diverse, were the very lifeblood of Rome's street food culture. They tell us not only what Romans ate, but how they lived. The vast majority of Thermopolium customers came from the lower classes: laborers, freedmen, slaves, migrants, sailors, and itinerant workers who populated Rome's insulae. These crowded apartment blocks rarely contained kitchens, forcing residents to eat outside. Archaeological evidence suggests that as many as 9 out of 10 Romans lived without cooking facilities, making public food stalls a necessity. The Thermopolia were thus not indulgence, but survival. Without them, the poor would have starved. The rhythm of the day shaped their crowds. At dawn, slaves and day laborers hurried to stalls for a quick bite before work, often bread dipped in wine, beans, or porridge. By midday, as heat rose and toil paused, crowds thickened. Construction workers, porters, craftsmen, and street vendors jostled for space at the counters. In the evening, after long hours of labor, customers returned for more substantial fare: lentil stews, sausages, or salted fish, washed down with cheap wine. The stalls pulsed with the cycle of Roman urban life, their rhythm echoing the rhythm of survival. The poor were not the only patrons. Freedmen, who had gained independence but not wealth, often relied on Thermopolia for convenience. Travelers arriving at ports or markets also frequented them, as did soldiers on leave, dock workers, and muleteers. For such men, the stalls were meeting points as well as kitchens. Archaeological finds of gaming pieces, dice, and graffiti in and around Thermopolia suggest that customers lingered, chatting, gambling, and socializing long after meals. In this sense, they functioned as proto-pubs or cafes, offering not only food but community. Yet for all their importance, Thermopolia carried stigma in elite eyes. Roman moralists sneered at those who ate outside. Juvenal mocked the rabble who filled smoky taverns, while Seneca described them as places of disorder and temptation. To the aristocracy, eating in public was shameful, a marker of poverty and moral weakness. Respectable citizens were expected to dine at home, surrounded by family or guests, reclining in triclinium dining rooms. Eating at a stall marked one as low-born, excluded from the rituals of domestic dining. Thus, the very act of standing at a counter with a bowl of soup was not just sustenance, it was identity. But for customers themselves, the stalls were indispensable. They were places of gossip, where news from markets, forums, and ports spread quickly. Politics, scandals, gladiatorial matches, all were discussed over bowls of beans. Some stalls became associated with particular groups, sailors gathering near docks, porters near markets, even gamblers who lingered over dice. To eat at a thermopolium was to be part of a community, however fragile or shifting. Archaeology adds vivid texture to this portrait. In Pompeii, graffiti near stalls advertises prices. Hot wine, 1 coin. Better wine, 2. Other inscriptions boast of dice games won or insults hurled. Such fragments reveal the voices of customers, ordinary Romans whose lives rarely appear in written histories. Their laughter, curses, and chatter once filled the air around those counters. They remind us that these stalls were not sterile spaces, but vibrant social nodes where hunger mingled with companionship. The variety of customers also reveals Rome's cosmopolitan character. Rome was a magnet for migrants from across the empire. Syrians, Egyptians, Greeks, Jews, Africans, and Gauls filled its streets. Many brought their foods and customs, and the stalls reflected this diversity. A sailor from Alexandria might find spiced fish reminiscent of home. A Greek craftsman might request wine flavored with resin. A Syrian merchant might recognize familiar lentil stews. The Thermopolia thus became crossroads of culinary cultures, shaping Roman street food into a blend of empire-wide influences. Not all customers were men. Though taverns were often depicted as male spaces, women also ate in Thermopolia. For poor women without kitchens, stalls were necessities. Widows, washerwomen, street vendors, and prostitutes likely relied on them daily. Elite authors often condemned such women as immoral, but again this reveals prejudice more than reality. For working women, the Thermopolia were simply survival. They remind us that the stalls fed not only laboring men, but entire families on the margins. The experience of eating at a thermopolium differed starkly from elite banquets. At aristocratic feasts, guests reclined on couches, served by slaves, entertained by music and poetry. At stalls, customers stood in noisy streets, bowls in hand, eating quickly amid dust, gossip, and laughter. Yet in some ways, the stalls offered a more democratic space. Here, freedmen mingled with slaves, migrants with citizens, women with men. Hunger dissolved boundaries, if only briefly. The counter became a leveler, even if the wider society remained stratified. The stigma of eating in public did not diminish the stall's importance. Instead, it underscores the deep divide between Rome's rich and poor. For elites, food was spectacle, art, excess. For the poor, food was necessity, bought daily from the hands of stallkeepers. To walk through a city filled with Thermopolia is to see this divide laid bare. Marble villas in one quarter, steaming counters in another. Both sustained Rome, but only one has dominated traditional history. Today, when we think of fast food, we imagine convenience, speed, and affordability. The Thermopolia embodied these same principles 2 millennia ago, but unlike modern restaurants, they were woven directly into survival. Their customers remind us that Rome was not only senators and emperors, but millions of anonymous laborers whose daily meal was bought, not cooked. To see Rome through their eyes is to see the empire not as marble and power, but as soup ladled into bowls by tired hands. Thus, The mouths of the masses complete the portrait begun with architecture and workers. The Thermopolia were not curiosities but vital arteries of Rome, sustaining a population too poor to cook, too busy to rest, yet rich in resilience. The customers, hungry, diverse, stigmatized, were the living proof that an empire runs not on rhetoric but on bread and beans. In the next chapter, we will step further into the bowls themselves. What exactly did Romans eat at these stalls? What ingredients filled the jars? What flavors spiced the soups? What drinks washed them down? If Chapter 4 has shown us who ate, Chapter 5 will reveal what they ate, leading us into the very tastes of ancient Rome's fast food. The counters of the Thermopolia were not merely places of exchange. They were altars of flavor, where the empire's diversity simmered in pots and clinked in cups. To step into one of these stalls was to inhale the mingled scents of beans, garlic, vinegar, and wine, drifting out into the dusty alleys of Rome or Pompeii. Here, hunger was satisfied not by feasts of silver platters, but by steaming bowls served for a coin. The food and drink of the Thermopolia tell us much about the tastes of the masses, the reach of trade, and the creativity of cooks working with humble ingredients. The staples were simple but sustaining. Pulse, a porridge made from emmer wheat or barley, was one of the most common dishes, often enriched with vegetables, herbs, or cheap cuts of meat. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans appeared constantly in the diet of Rome's poor, boiled into thick soups or seasoned with onions, leeks, and coriander. Archaeological residues found in Dolia jars include traces of beans, grains, and fish, confirming the centrality of legumes and cereals. These were the true fast food of antiquity, cheap, filling, and quick to serve. Meat, though less common, was not absent. Sausages were popular, often spiced with pepper or cumin, stuffed with offal and fat. Offal itself, liver, lungs, tripe, featured heavily in stews, as wealthier cuts were beyond the reach of the poor. Pork, the most common Roman meat, appeared in salted or cured form, shaved into soups or sold as small morsels. In one Pompeian thermopolium, bones of piglets were found alongside duck and fish remains, suggesting a surprising variety even in humble stalls. Such finds remind us that while the staples were plain, occasional variety colored the diet of those who could spare a little more coin. Fish was abundant, thanks to Rome's control of Mediterranean trade. Salted fish, often imported from Spain, appeared in stews or as garnish. Anchovy paste, known as garum, flavored many dishes. This pungent sauce, made by fermenting fish innards with salt, was the ketchup of the Roman world, poured liberally over bread, beans, and meat alike. To modern palates, the smell might have been overwhelming, but for Romans, it was indispensable. A spoonful of garum transformed plain porridge into a savory meal. Its presence in Thermopolia jars reveals how even the poor sought flavor beyond mere sustenance. Bread was the constant companion of every meal. Bakeries in Rome and Pompeii produced round loaves, sometimes stamped with seals, that were sold cheaply to the masses. Customers of Thermopolia often paired bowls of stew with hunks of bread, dipping it into soups or spreading it with cheese. Carbonized loaves found at Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius, show the texture of these breads, dense, hearty, designed to fill. Bread was the anchor of the diet, just as it was the anchor of Roman politics. Bread and circuses, Juvenal quipped, kept the people content. Wine was as essential as bread. But the wine of the Thermopolia was not the rich Falernian vintage praised in elite banquets. It was cheap, sour, often watered down and flavored with herbs or honey. Graffiti at Pompeii advertises wine at different prices, the lowest for 1 coin, better wine for 2, and Falernian for 4. The poor rarely tasted the best. Instead, they drank what was available, diluted to stretch supplies. Yet even the humblest cup carried warmth, sociability, and the comfort of ritual. To drink at a stall was to join a community, however fleeting. Seasonings added depth to simple fare. Romans loved strong flavors: vinegar, garlic, leeks, mustard seeds, pepper imported from India, and herbs like dill and mint. Even the poor found ways to season beans and porridge, making meals more palatable. Archaeological evidence of spice residues in Dolia suggests that cooks at Thermopolia were adept at flavoring humble dishes, turning monotony into variety. Here we glimpse the creativity of stall-keepers, who knew that taste was as important as filling stomachs. The presentation of food was direct. Customers stood at counters, bowls ladled from steaming jars, bread handed across, wine poured into clay or wooden cups. There were no courses, no elaborate service. Meals were functional, designed for speed. Yet within this simplicity lay comfort. The warmth of a bowl, the familiar tang of garum, the crust of bread dipped into lentil soup. These were the daily pleasures of Rome's poor. Some stalls offered special treats. Frescoes on Thermopolia walls depict ducks, geese, and even seafood, suggesting occasional luxury. In wealthier neighborhoods, stalls may have served more varied fare, catering to freedmen or travelers with a few extra coins. But always, the focus was accessibility. The genius of the Thermopolia was not culinary extravagance, but reliability, a place where, for a small price, hunger was stilled. Roman writers, predictably, looked down on this food. Martial mocked taverns for serving stale bread and cheap wine. Seneca condemned those who gorged on beans and onions in smoky stalls. To elites, this food was vulgar, the fare of the masses. Yet their disdain reveals the divide between elite feasting and popular sustenance. For the poor, beans and bread were not vulgar, but life itself. The stalls that sold them were not dens of vice, but sanctuaries of survival. Modern parallels abound. Today, street food thrives on similar principles: affordable, quick, flavorful, tied to working-class needs. From curry stalls in India to noodle carts in China, tacos in Mexico to hot dogs in New York, the essence remains the same. The Thermopolia remind us that the desire for hot, cheap, flavorful food has always been universal. Hunger is ancient, but so is the ingenuity of meeting it. The food of the Thermopolia also reveals something deeper: the globalization of the Roman world. Beans from North Africa, fish sauce from Spain, pepper from India, wine from Italy, all met in the jars of a single stall. To eat at a Thermopolium was to taste empire itself, a blend of local necessity and distant trade. Rome's poor, though marginalized, consumed a diet that reflected global networks of power and commerce. In their bowls of beans and bread lay the imprint of empire. Thus, the food and drink of the Thermopolia complete the picture of daily sustenance. They were humble, yes, but also creative, flavorful, and global. They fed not only bodies but spirits, giving comfort to lives crowded and insular and shaped by toil. To dismiss them as vulgar is to miss their essence. They were the cuisine of resilience, the street food of survival, the taste of Rome's true majority. In the next chapter, we will explore the darker side of these establishments, the stigma they carried, the moral anxieties they provoked, and the criticisms hurled by Rome's elite. If Chapter 5 has shown us what Romans ate, Chapter 6 will show us what others thought about it, revealing how a bowl of beans could stir debate about virtue, vice, and the very soul of the empire. If the Thermopolia fed Rome's millions, they also scandalized its elites. To senators, philosophers, and moralists, these bustling stalls were more than mere eateries. They were symbols of disorder, vice, and decline. Writers from Seneca to Juvenal cast them as smoky dens where the poor squandered coins on cheap wine, where thieves and prostitutes mingled, where quarrels erupted over dice or drink. The food itself was dismissed as vulgar, the customers as rabble. To understand the strange stigma attached to the Thermopolia is to glimpse Rome's class anxieties and the cultural fault lines that divided its society. The disdain began with the very act of eating in public. For the Roman elite, meals were meant to be private, domestic, and controlled. The ideal citizen dined at home, reclining on couches in the triclinium, attended by slaves, surrounded by family or honored guests. Eating was ritual, status, and spectacle. To eat standing at a counter in the street was to betray poverty, and poverty was associated with moral weakness. Philosophers like Seneca equated public dining with lack of discipline, warning against indulgence in beans and onions sold at smoky stalls. The very visibility of Thermopolia made them offensive. They exposed the hunger of the masses, which the elite preferred to ignore. The atmosphere of the stalls reinforced elite suspicion. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Thermopolia doubled as taverns, where wine was served into the evening. Dice games were common, as were quarrels fueled by drink. Graffiti from Pompeii depicts boasts about gambling wins and insults hurled at rivals, testifying to the rowdy nature of these spaces. Juvenal, ever the satirist, painted taverns as breeding grounds for crime, where thieves schemed and women sold their virtue. Whether or not this was fair, the association stuck. Thermopolia became shorthand for vice in elite discourse. Prostitution was another stain on their reputation. Roman law often conflated taverns, inns, and brothels, and in many cases, these functions overlapped. Women working in stalls sometimes sold more than wine. Some establishments likely provided rooms for illicit encounters. For moralists, this blurred line confirmed their suspicion that Thermopolia were dens of corruption. Female innkeepers, Caponi, were derided as immoral, their establishments as unfit for respectable citizens. Yet for poor women, working in or near these stalls may have been one of few economic options available. The stigma was as much about class and gender prejudice as about reality. The food itself came under attack. Elites celebrated banquets with exotic meats, fine fish, and imported wines. By contrast, the fare of the Thermopolia, beans, lentils, sausages, diluted wine, was scorned as coarse. Martial mocked taverns for serving stale bread and sour wine. Pliny described the diets of the poor with pity, contrasting their bean stews with the delicacies of the wealthy. The disdain was not only culinary but symbolic. To sneer at Thermopolia food was to reinforce social hierarchy. What was daily sustenance for millions was, in elite eyes, a marker of inferiority. But the stigma was not only about food or drink. It was about space. The Thermopolia were public, noisy, open to all. Slaves, freedmen, migrants, and women mingled there, groups often excluded from elite banquets. To conservative senators, such mingling was dangerous. These stalls were places where gossip flowed, where politics might be discussed, where solidarity among the poor could form. Just as Murad IV feared coffee houses in Istanbul centuries later, Roman elites feared any space where the masses gathered beyond their control. To brand Thermopolia as dens of vice was also to delegitimize them as spaces of community. The moral panic surrounding these establishments reveals a broader anxiety, the fear of urban disorder. Rome, with its million inhabitants, was always on the edge of chaos. Fires, riots, and grain shortages could erupt suddenly. The poor, crowded into insulae and reliant on food distributions and stalls, were volatile. To elites, the Thermopolia embodied this volatility, crowded, loud, unregulated. Their existence was tolerated out of necessity, but scorned as symbols of what the ruling classes most feared, the power of the urban mob. And yet, the elite disdain was laced with hypocrisy. Wealthy Romans sometimes slipped into taverns in disguise, indulging in cheap thrills away from prying eyes. Satirical poetry hints at senators gambling in back rooms, equestrians drinking sour wine, and aristocrats consorting with prostitutes. Their condemnations, then, were often performative, reinforcing status while secretly participating in the very vices they denounced. This duality is one of history's constants. Those who condemn most loudly are often those most tempted. Archaeology complicates the literary picture. While writers depict Thermopolia as sordid, the stalls excavated at Pompeii and Herculaneum are often brightly decorated, their frescoes depicting food, animals, and mythological scenes. Counters were neatly built, jars well arranged. These were not filthy hovels, but organized businesses. Residues of beans, bread, meat, and wine suggest variety. Inscriptions advertising prices reveal transparency. Far from chaotic dens, many were orderly establishments serving practical needs. The dissonance between elite rhetoric and archaeological reality underscores how stigma reflected prejudice more than truth. The stigma of Thermopolia also reveals how societies use food to police class. Just as medieval nobles banned peasants from wearing silk or colonial rulers outlawed native rituals, Roman elites mocked public dining to reinforce their superiority. Food became boundary, stall counters became lines of division. To eat at a Thermopolium was to accept one's place at the bottom. Yet for the poor, such stigma was irrelevant. They ate where they could, lived as they must, and found in these stalls not shame, but survival. Today, we might compare this stigma to attitudes toward street food in many societies. Where elites prefer restaurants, street stalls are sometimes dismissed as dirty, unsafe, or low class. Yet they remain indispensable to millions. In reality, street food often offers authenticity, community, and resilience. The echoes of Roman prejudice remind us that stigma often says more about the powerful than about the powerless. Thus, the dens of vice reveal not only Rome's class prejudice, but also its dependence on the very institutions it despised. The city could not function without Thermopolia, the poor could not eat without them. The elite scorned them, yet their very disdain acknowledged their ubiquity. The stigma was real, but so was the reliance. In the next chapter, we will move beyond stigma to explore the stalls as social spaces. For despite elite condemnation, the Thermopolia were not only kitchens but gathering points, places where community, gossip, and even politics simmered alongside beans and wine. If Chapter 6 has shown us how the stalls were judged, Chapter 7 will show us how they were lived, revealing the vibrancy of Rome's street culture. To imagine a Thermopolium solely as a place of eating is to miss its essence. These stalls were kitchens, yes, but also forums of the common people, where conversation, laughter, and tension mixed as freely as beans and wine. They were meeting points, crossroads, and social hubs. If elite villas represented the private world of Rome's aristocracy, then the Thermopolia represented the public world of the masses. Here, community was forged not in marble atriums, but in smoky rooms, over counters of stone. The design of the stalls encouraged interaction. Counters faced directly onto the street, blurring the line between inside and outside. Passers-by could pause, lean, exchange a coin for a bowl, and linger to talk. There were no doors to shut out noise, no private dining rooms to isolate classes. Instead, the Thermopolium was porous, open to the flow of urban life. Customers jostled shoulder to shoulder, exchanging gossip while waiting for food. The very act of eating became public performance, woven into the spectacle of the street. In this openness lay community. Archaeological finds at Pompeii and Herculaneum suggest that many stalls were decorated with frescoes and graffiti, not simply for aesthetics, but as shared cultural markers. Walls bore images of roosters, dogs, and fish, symbols of protection, abundance, or humor. Graffiti scrawled beside them recorded boasts, insults, or games of dice. Such marks are voices preserved in stone, fragments of conversation left by ordinary people. They remind us that these counters were not silent, but alive with chatter. What did people talk about? Everything and nothing. The latest gladiatorial games at the amphitheater, the outcome of chariot races, rumors of imperial politics, complaints about prices of bread. News in Rome spread not through official decrees alone, but through word of mouth, carried in the spaces where people gathered. The Thermopolia were nodes of this network. Just as modern cafes and street stalls buzz with debate and rumor, so too did these ancient counters. They were Rome's rumor mills, sustaining the social fabric as much as the stomach. For the poor, they also provided community in a city that was otherwise isolating. Insuli were crowded, noisy, often anonymous. Families lived piled atop one another, with little privacy or comfort. The street stall offered an escape, a place where neighbors could meet, laborers could rest, migrants could find companionship. Shared hunger forged solidarity. In the clatter of bowls and the warmth of food, people found not only sustenance, but belonging. The stalls also carried social risks. Quarrels sometimes erupted, fueled by drink or gambling. Graffiti testifies to dice games played on counters, where fortunes were won and lost in moments. Juvenal describes taverns as breeding grounds for violence, with tempers flaring and daggers drawn. While exaggerated, such accounts suggest that the Thermopolia could be volatile. Yet volatility itself was part of their social fabric. These were places of passion as well as comfort, where emotions spilled as freely as wine. Despite elite disdain, the stalls also created spaces of unexpected equality. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of villas, where guests were carefully ranked, the Thermopolia mixed classes in ways that unsettled the powerful. Freedmen stood beside slaves, migrants beside citizens, women beside men. Hunger leveled distinctions, if only for the duration of a meal. This mingling, though scorned by elites, gave the poor a rare sense of shared humanity. The stall was not only a place of eating but of recognition, where one's existence was affirmed in the company of others. Women's presence in these spaces further complicates the picture. Elite writers often sneered at female tavern-goers, portraying them as prostitutes or immoral. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that women did frequent stalls, both as customers and as workers. For poor women without kitchens, the Thermopolia were as necessary as for men. For widows and laborers, they offered sustenance. For others, perhaps companionship. Their presence underscores the inclusivity of these spaces, even if filtered through the prejudice of elite sources. The social role of the Thermopolia extended beyond daily meals. They functioned as informal clubs, where groups gathered regularly. Sailors had their favored stalls near harbors, mule drivers near markets, gamblers near busy crossroads. These loyalties turned stalls into micro-communities, where familiar faces met day after day. Archaeological graffiti reveals names scratched into walls, declarations of friendship, even insults aimed at rivals. Each stall thus became a node in a web of relationships, anchoring people in the vast, overwhelming sprawl of the city. Religion, too, touched these spaces. Small shrines to household gods, laras, have been found in or near stalls, suggesting that stall-keepers invoked divine protection over their trade and customers. To eat and drink under such guardianship was to share not only food but ritual. Festivals and holy days likely spilled into Thermopolia, where celebratory meals and libations marked the turning of the year. In this sense, stalls were not separate from religion but extensions of it, blending the sacred and the profane in the rhythms of daily life. The vitality of these spaces becomes clearer when we compare them to modern equivalents. Today, cafes and street stalls often serve as centers of community, particularly in working-class districts. Tea shops in Cairo, taco stands in Mexico, noodle carts in Bangkok. All are more than eateries. They are places of conversation, debate, gossip, and solidarity. The Thermopolia were their ancestors, fulfilling the same function in Rome's bustling streets. When we stand at a counter today, chatting with strangers over hot food, we replicate a ritual that has spanned millennia. Elite disdain for these spaces, then, was not only about food but about fear of community. The powerful preferred to control gatherings, to regulate spaces where people meet. The Thermopolia escaped that control. They were messy, noisy, and unpredictable. In their openness lay both their danger and their strength. They gave voice to the voiceless, space to the marginalized, belonging to the forgotten. No wonder the powerful mocked them as dens of vice. They were, in truth, counters of community. Thus, when we look at the Thermopolia, we see not only jars of beans and cups of wine, but the beating heart of Roman social life. They were stages where the poor enacted their daily survival, where identities were affirmed, friendships formed, and rumors spread. They were Rome's living rooms, set not in marble, but in the street. In the next chapter, we will move from the social to the political. For if the Thermopolia were centers of community, they also intersected with Rome's greatest vulnerability, the politics of food supply. Hunger was never only personal, it was political. Chapter 8 will reveal how food stalls connected to the grain supply, the annona, and the delicate balance that sustained the empire itself. In Rome, food was never merely nourishment. It was politics, power, and survival. The mighty aqueducts and marble forums dazzled visitors, but the empire's stability rested on something more fragile: grain. Without bread, the capital's masses could not be controlled, and without control of the masses, emperors trembled. Into this precarious balance stepped the Thermopolia, humble food stalls that transformed the grain arriving from Africa, Sicily, and Egypt into bowls of porridge, bread, and stew. To understand these stalls is to see them not only as kitchens of the poor, but as extensions of Rome's political economy, caught in the delicate web of hunger and governance. The foundation of this system was the annona, the grain dole. By the late Republic and into the Empire, the Roman state distributed free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens. This policy was not altruism, it was necessity. Rome's population, over 1 million at its peak, was too large to feed itself from local harvests. Grain ships arrived from the provinces, their cargoes stored in vast huria granaries, then doled out monthly. Bread and grain became the emperor's currency of legitimacy. Bread and circuses, Juvenal quipped, were the tools that kept the mob content. The Thermopolia existed in the shadow of this system. Their stews and porridges relied on the same grain that fed the dole. When shipments faltered, due to storms, piracy, or mismanagement, prices soared and stalls suffered. Hungry crowds filled the streets, sometimes rioting, demanding food. In 51 BCE, Cicero wrote anxiously of the danger when grain ships were delayed, noting that the people became restless and violent. For stallkeepers, such moments were disasters. Without cheap grain, they could not feed customers at affordable prices. For customers, it was catastrophe. Without stalls, they could not eat. Hunger in Rome was always political, and the Thermopolia were where it was most keenly felt. Emperors understood this link. Augustus, the first emperor, reformed the grain dole to ensure steady supply, winning the loyalty of the people. Claudius personally braved storms to oversee grain imports, reinforcing his image as provider. Domitian regulated bakers and sellers to prevent shortages. The politics of food was thus inseparable from the politics of power. Every emperor was, in some sense, a baker-in-chief, judged not by rhetoric but by whether the poor could fill their bowls at stalls. Yet reliance on imported grain created vulnerability. The empire's lifeline stretched across the Mediterranean. Grain ships from Egypt were particularly crucial, carrying harvests up the Nile, across the sea, and into Ostia, Rome's harbor. From there, barges ferried grain up the Tiber. A storm at sea, a revolt in Egypt, or piracy in Sicily could starve the capital. In such moments, the Thermopolia became barometers of crisis. When their jars emptied, the streets grew restless. The humble stall thus mirrored the empire's global reach and its fragility. The stalls also intersected with the economics of scarcity. Stallkeepers bought grain or bread in bulk, then transformed it into stews and soups sold cheaply by the bowl. Their profit margins were slim, dependent on stable prices. When grain was plentiful, stalls thrived. When prices spiked, they cut portions or watered wine. Customers complained, riots threatened, and elites blamed tavern keepers for profiteering. In truth, stallkeepers were caught in a system beyond their control, squeezed between imperial politics and popular hunger. Elite disdain for Thermopolia carried political undertones. To sneer at public dining was not only to mock poverty, but to reinforce dependence on state generosity. The stalls reminded elites of the masses' vulnerability and their power. A crowd fed was manageable. A crowd hungry was revolutionary. To dismiss Thermopolia as dens of vice was also to deny their role as safety valves in a city always one missed grain ship away from chaos. The archaeology of Pompeii and Herculaneum, though provincial, illustrates these dynamics. Analysis of residues in jars reveals diets centered on beans, bread, and cereals, the very staples tied to Rome's grain networks. Prices scratched onto walls suggest customers debated affordability. Inscriptions boasting "best wine here, 1 coin" reveal attempts to lure customers with bargains in times of plenty. Even in smaller cities, stalls reflected the tension between abundance and scarcity. If Pompeii's counters hummed with steady trade, Rome's pulsed with anxiety, for the stakes were infinitely higher. The political dimension of food stalls also emerges in their role as spaces of rumor. As we saw in Chapter 7, gossip flowed freely across counters. News of grain shortages, imperial decrees, or price changes spread quickly. In times of scarcity, such talk could inflame unrest. Authorities feared not only the physical hunger of the poor, but the conversations that hunger provoked. A rumor whispered over a bowl of beans could spark protests in the forum. The Thermopolia were thus not passive victims of politics, but active participants in it, shaping opinion at the street level. Comparisons with later societies sharpen the picture. In 18th century Paris, bread shortages sparked riots that helped ignite revolution. Bakers' shops were stormed, and the cry for bread became a cry for justice. In Istanbul, coffee houses were suppressed by sultans fearful of dissent. In each case, food spaces doubled as political spaces. Rome's Thermopolia fit this pattern. Humble kitchens that doubled as crucibles of unrest. Their counters were as political as the Senate, their jars as telling as imperial decrees. The politics of hunger also reveals a profound truth about empire. Power rests not only on legions or laws, but on stomachs. Rome could conquer Britain and Judea, but if grain ships failed, the city rioted. Thermopolia, in their modest way, were the front line of this reality. They were where imperial policy met daily hunger, where Augustus' reforms or Claudius' voyages became tangible in bowls of porridge or cups of wine. They remind us that empire was lived not in marble forums, but in the hum of street stalls, where the poor judged emperors not by words, but by whether they ate that day. Yet there is irony here. The same stalls scorned by elites as vulgar were essential to imperial stability. The same beans mocked by satirists were the glue that held the capital together. The Thermopolia, despised and indispensable, embodied the paradox of Rome. Grandeur built on fragility, power sustained by porridge. Thus, when we speak of grain and grit, we speak of more than food. We speak of politics, survival, and the delicate thread on which empire hung. The Thermopolia were not only kitchens of the poor, they were mirrors of Rome's greatest vulnerability. To look into their jars is to see not only beans and wine, but the fragility of an empire that could conquer the world but trembled before hunger. In the next chapter, we will shift from politics to culture. For the Thermopolia were not only tied to grain and power, but also to the rhythms of entertainment. Chapter 9 will lead us into the connection between food stalls and Roman leisure, theaters, baths, and games, where street food became part of the spectacle of pleasure as much as survival. If hunger fed the Thermopolia, pleasure drew them outward into Rome's spaces of leisure. To imagine these stalls only as survival kitchens is to miss half their story. They did not exist in isolation, tucked into back alleys alone. They clung to the walls of amphitheaters, lined the approaches to baths, and stood within reach of markets and theaters. They were as much part of the spectacle of Roman leisure as gladiators, actors, and hot springs. In Rome, to watch, to bathe, to gamble, to cheer. These acts were inseparable from eating and drinking. The Thermopolia, humble though they were, became partners in Rome's pleasures. The amphitheater was perhaps the clearest stage for this marriage of food and entertainment. When crowds poured into the Colosseum or provincial arenas, they brought appetites with them. Spectators might arrive at dawn and remain until dusk, watching gladiators battle, animals hunted, or criminals executed. Such endurance required sustenance. Food stalls thrived around these arenas, serving bread, sausages, beans, and wine to roaring crowds. Graffiti from Pompeii's amphitheater references taverns and vendors, confirming their presence. The atmosphere must have resembled a modern stadium, where cheers mingled with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. For all their brutality, the games were also festivals of consumption. Baths offered another nexus of food and leisure. Rome's public baths, vast complexes with hot pools, cold plunges, exercise yards, and gardens, drew thousands daily. They were centers not only of hygiene, but of sociability, relaxation, and display. And where people gathered, food followed. Thermopolia clustered around bath complexes, ready to serve visitors who emerged refreshed and hungry. Literary sources describe vendors hawking snacks outside, while archaeological remains confirm stalls near baths in Pompeii and Ostia. To bathe was to cleanse body and soul. To eat afterward at a stall was to replenish strength. Together, baths and Thermopolia formed rhythms of leisure that defined Roman urban life. Theaters and circuses provided similar opportunities. Plays and races drew massive crowds, often lasting hours. Vendors circulated with trays, but fixed stalls also profited. Customers grabbed quick bites before entering or during intermissions, washing down beans or sausages with diluted wine. Ancient critics complained of the noise and disorder, likening theaters to taverns as much as temples of art. The line between performance and feast was porous. Food was part of the show. Just as modern cinema audiences line up for popcorn or stadium fans for hot dogs, Roman theatergoers expected to eat. The Thermopolia were not incidental, but integral to the experience. What unites these spaces is the mingling of necessity and festivity. At the amphitheater, food sustained long hours of brutal spectacle. At baths, it extended relaxation into indulgence. At theaters and circuses, it transformed waiting into pleasure. The Thermopolia fed not only the hunger of survival, but the hunger of leisure. They reveal Rome not only as a city of politics and poverty, but as a city of play, where food and spectacle were entwined. Elite attitudes toward this mingling were predictably scornful. Moralists condemned the masses for gorging on sausages at the games, washing down bloodshed with cheap wine. Seneca sneered at those who emerged from baths only to overindulge at stalls. Yet their complaints reveal how inseparable food was from leisure. The people did not compartmentalize hunger and pleasure, they wove them together. To be Roman was to eat not only to live but to watch, to cheer, to bathe, to belong. Archaeology again sharpens the picture. In Pompeii, Thermopolia have been found along the Via dell'Abbondanza, leading to the amphitheater, and near the Stabian Baths, the largest in the city. Their locations were not accidental. They clustered where crowds gathered, like modern food trucks outside stadiums or fairs. Frescoes of amphorae, animals, and mythological scenes adorned their walls, drawing customers in. Counters with jars offered quick service, while benches sometimes allowed lingering. These stalls reveal an economy of entertainment. Leisure created demand, and food stalls met it. The foods served at leisure mirrored those of daily survival, but with festive flair. Sausages grilled fresh, fish fried in oil, sweetened wine, honey cakes, and nuts offered variety. While beans and bread filled the jars of daily meals, leisure encouraged indulgence. Vendors outside arenas or baths may have charged higher prices, capitalizing on demand. Customers paid willingly, for leisure was incomplete without taste. The link between food and pleasure was as strong as the link between food and hunger. The role of Thermopolia in leisure also underscores their place in community identity. To eat together at a stall outside the Colosseum was to share not only food but collective experience. Families, friends, and strangers gathered shoulder to shoulder, bound by spectacle and sustenance. The noise of the crowd, the scent of food, the thrill of games, these fused into memories of belonging. Food stalls were not sideshows but anchors of communal life. Comparisons with later and modern societies make this continuity clear. Medieval fairs featured vendors of pies and ale, Renaissance theaters sold snacks. Today's concerts, festivals, and sports events are unthinkable without food stalls. The impulse is universal. Where people gather for spectacle, food follows. Rome's Thermopolia were early expressions of this truth, binding leisure and consumption into one. Their presence also reveals how Rome's poor accessed pleasure. Elite banquets and feasts excluded them, but amphitheaters, baths, and circuses were public. There, through food stalls, they participated in leisure on their own terms. The stall transformed survival into festivity, offering not only beans but belonging. In this sense, the Thermopolia democratized pleasure, giving the poor a taste of celebration otherwise denied. Yet they also highlight contradictions. The same stalls that sustained joy also profited from bloodshed. To eat sausages while watching gladiators bleed was to participate in a culture where violence and consumption were entwined. Critics condemned this callousness, yet it reveals how Rome normalized spectacle. Food dulled conscience, turning cruelty into carnival. The Thermopolia, unwittingly, were accomplices in this transformation. Thus, the stalls remind us that Rome's street food culture was not only about survival or stigma, but also about leisure, pleasure, and identity. They reveal how food flows to where people gather, how hunger and play intertwine, how community forms in shared consumption. They remind us that an empire was not only governed by law and war, but by festivals of appetite and spectacle. In the next chapter, we will step from the baths and arenas back into the stalls themselves to consider their economics. Who owned them? How profitable were they? What risks and rewards did stallkeepers face? If Chapter 9 has shown us how stalls intersected with leisure, Chapter 10 will show us how they functioned as businesses within Rome's vast and complex economy. If the Thermopolia were the kitchens of Rome's poor and the companions of its spectacles, They were also businesses, small enterprises run by men and women who balanced risk, profit, and survival in the empire's crowded economy. Behind every ladle of beans or cup of wine lay transactions, negotiations, and calculations. The counters of stone were also counters of currency, where coins passed daily in a hum of exchange. To understand the stalls fully, we must step into their economic life, where ambition and precariousness walked hand in hand. Ownership of these establishments varied. Many were operated by freedmen, former slaves who had earned or purchased freedom. Lacking land or aristocratic status, freedmen often turned to commerce. A thermopolium offered a modest but viable path to stability, a steady stream of customers, manageable overhead, and daily cash flow. Others were owned by wealthier patrons but staffed by slaves or hired labor. In such cases, the stall functioned like a franchise, the owner collecting profits while the workers endured the grind. Women too appear in records, particularly as innkeepers, coponi, suggesting that widows or freed women managed stalls. In every case, ownership reflected Rome's complex social mobility, where commerce offered opportunity to those excluded from elite avenues of power. The economics of a thermopolium were delicate. Margins were thin, dependent on bulk purchase of grain, beans, and wine. Stallkeepers bought from bakers, farmers, or wholesalers at markets, then transformed these into ready meals. Their profit came not from luxury, but from volume. Dozens, even hundreds, of bowls sold daily for a coin apiece. Archaeological graffiti advertising prices confirms this. Wine for 1 coin. Better wine, 2. Falernian, 4. This tiered pricing reveals business savvy, offering options for different pockets, much like modern food stalls upselling premium items. Costs, however, were constant. Rent for space on the ground floor of an insula could be high, especially in prime locations near baths, forums, or amphitheaters. Taxes or bribes to officials ate into profits. Fuel for fires, upkeep of jars and counters, purchase of ingredients, all demanded steady investment. Workers, whether slaves or hired help, had to be managed. A single bad week, caused by grain shortages, storms delaying shipments, or sudden political unrest, could ruin a small stall. Risk was omnipresent. Fires were common in crowded insulae, and one blaze could consume not only stock, but livelihood. Theft was another hazard. Coins snatched, wine stolen, or customers fleeing without paying. Moral stigma, too, carried economic costs. Elites sneered at stallkeepers, associating them with vice and dishonesty. Customers might haggle aggressively, accusing vendors of watering wine or skimping on portions. Reputation mattered immensely. A stall known for generous servings or flavorful stews drew crowds. One branded as stingy or dishonest might wither. Graffiti boasting of the best wine here reflects the competitive need to advertise and attract. Yet for all its risks, a successful thermopolium could be rewarding. Freedmen who prospered in such trades sometimes rose in status, funding public works or sponsoring games. Inscriptions record tavern keepers who gained local respect, remembered in epitaphs not as shady figures, but as beloved community providers. Success stories, though rare, testify to the possibility of upward mobility through humble commerce. The stalls also reveal the broader structure of Rome's economy. They illustrate how deeply cash-based it was. Coins circulated constantly, with even the poor expected to pay for meals daily. They show the reliance on trade networks, with beans, grain, wine, and fish sauce arriving from distant provinces. They underscore the importance of urban demand. The city's million mouths created vast markets, sustaining thousands of stalls. In this sense, the Thermopolia were nodes in an empire-spanning economy, where Egyptian grain, Spanish garum, and Italian wine met in bowls served for a coin. The business of the Thermopolia also sheds light on Rome's labor market. Stall work was grueling, long hours, heavy lifting, constant exposure to heat and smoke. For slaves, it was simply another duty, but for freedmen or wage workers, it was survival. Their presence underscores how Rome's economy relied on both coerced and free labor, blended in ways that blur modern distinctions. The stallkeeper might be free, but his cook a slave, the server freeborn, but her assistant a bonded worker. This complexity was not anomaly, but norm. The precariousness of these enterprises mirrors small businesses across history. Street vendors in medieval Europe, hawkers in colonial markets, modern food cart owners, all faced the same fragility. A storm, a shortage, a bribe, a fine, any could undo them. Yet they also reveal resilience, the ability to adapt, innovate, and persist. The stallkeeper of Rome, like the vendor today, was entrepreneur and survivor alike. Elite attitudes toward these businesses reveal a paradox. On one hand, elites scorned them as vulgar. Philosophers derided tavern keepers as dishonest. Satirists mocked their food as coarse. On the other hand, the economy depended on them. Without stalls, the poor could not eat, and without the poor, the city could not function. The scorn of the powerful was thus laced with dependence. It is a paradox that echoes across history. Those who disdain small trades often rely on them most. Archaeological evidence further enriches the economic portrait. Counters with multiple jars suggest stalls designed for variety and volume. Frescoes advertising animals or wine hint at marketing strategies. Finds of coins in and around stalls confirm constant cash exchange. Carbonized remains of bread and beans reveal the staples that drove sales. Together, these details illustrate not just survival, but entrepreneurship, as stallkeepers sought to attract customers in crowded markets. The Thermopolia, then, were more than dens of beans and wine. They were microeconomies, reflecting the empire's global reach, its cash flow, its labor structures, and its class divides. They reveal the precariousness of small enterprise and the resilience of those who ran them. They remind us that behind every coin exchanged lay not only hunger, but ambition. In modern parallels, we see echoes everywhere. Street vendors in megacities today live precariously, squeezed by rents, regulations, and competition, yet they sustain millions. Food carts, hawkers, stalls, all face stigma from elites yet remain indispensable. The Roman Thermopolia were their ancestors, bearing the same burdens and resilience. Thus, to hear coins clink across a Roman counter is to hear more than commerce. It is to hear the pulse of an economy, the struggles of small entrepreneurs, the lifeline of the poor. The business of the Thermopolia reveals Rome not as marble glory alone, but as fragile networks of beans, bread, and coins, sustained by the hands of those history too often forgets. In the next chapter, we will shift from economy to identity. For the Thermopolia were not only businesses, but symbols, shaping how Romans imagined class, culture, and morality. Chapter 11 will explore how these stalls became mirrors of Roman society itself, reflecting the values, prejudices, and contradictions of empire. Food is never only about sustenance, it is about identity. What we eat, where we eat, and with whom we eat mark who we are and where we belong. In Rome, this truth was sharpened by inequality. The patrician reclined at banquets of silver platters and exotic game, while the poor stood at smoky counters with bowls of beans. The Thermopolia, humble though they were, became more than eateries. They were mirrors, reflecting Rome's class divides, cultural prejudices, and moral anxieties. To peer into their jars is to see not only stew, but society itself. For the poor, eating at a thermopolium was a necessity. Instantly, Rome's crowded apartment blocks lacked kitchens. Residents lived in cramped rooms, often without even a hearth. Cooking indoors risked fire, a constant hazard in a city of wood and overcrowding. Thus, the poor had little choice but to eat outside. To line up at a counter with a coin in hand was not shame, but survival. In this sense, the Thermopolia embodied the lived reality of the majority, their dependence on public food, their vulnerability to grain prices, their daily struggle. For the elite, however, the very visibility of this dependence was distasteful. Philosophers and moralists derided those who dined publicly, equating it with vulgarity. Seneca spoke of taverns as dens of indulgence. Juvenal mocked the rabble who gorged on beans. To elites, the act of eating in the street was a marker of low status, a sign of poverty and moral laxity. Yet this disdain was less about the food itself than about what it represented, a reminder that most Romans lived precariously, unable to retreat into private dining rooms. The Thermopolia forced into view the inequality the elite preferred to forget. The stalls also reflected cultural diversity. Rome was a cosmopolitan empire, drawing migrants from across the Mediterranean. Syrians, Greeks, Egyptians, Africans, and Gauls filled its streets. Many brought culinary traditions with them, flavors that filtered into the stalls. Lentil stews reminiscent of the East, spiced wines, salted fish. In this sense, the Thermopolia were multicultural spaces where the empire's diversity mingled in bowls of food. Yet for elites, this cosmopolitanism was another cause for suspicion. They saw taverns as places where foreigners gathered, where strange foods and tongues mingled, threatening Roman purity. The stalls thus became symbols of cultural anxiety, mirrors of an empire both enriched and unsettled by diversity. Gender, too, was reflected in their counters. Women did eat at Thermopolia, but elite authors often painted them as prostitutes or immoral. To see a woman at a stall was, in elite eyes, scandalous. Yet archaeology suggests reality was different. Poor women needed these stalls as much as men, and some even managed them. The presence of women challenges elite stereotypes, reminding us that identity in these spaces was more fluid than moralists admitted. The stalls mirrored not only class, but also gender dynamics, exposing how prejudice distorted perception. Religion also shaped identity at the stalls. Shrines to household gods, Laras, were found in or near some Thermopolia, suggesting that stall keepers invoked divine protection over their trade and customers. Eating at such counters was thus not purely secular, but tinged with ritual. Holy days and festivals likely spilled into stalls, where special foods and wine marked the occasion. In this sense, the Thermopolia mirrored the sacred rhythms of Roman life, blending daily survival with devotion. The stalls also mirrored morality. To elites, they symbolized indulgence, idleness, vice. Dice games, prostitution, drunkenness, all were associated with taverns. But to the poor, they symbolized community, comfort, and necessity. One person's vice was another's survival. This divide reveals how morality often reflects perspective. The same bowl of beans seen as vulgar from above was cherished as life from below. Archaeology complicates elite prejudice. Excavations at Pompeii reveal counters carefully built, frescoes brightly painted, jars neatly arranged. Some stalls advertised prices openly, suggesting fairness. Others displayed frescoes of animals or food, signaling pride in trade. These were not chaotic dens, but organized businesses, serving communities with care. The archaeological mirror reflects dignity, where literary mirrors reflected vice. Which is true. Likely both. Some stalls were rowdy, others respectable. Identity, like reflection, shifts with angle. The Thermopolia also mirrored Rome's contradictions. They were despised yet indispensable, scorned yet omnipresent. Elites mocked them, yet relied on them to feed the poor and prevent unrest. They embodied the paradox of empire. Grandeur built on fragility, wealth sustained by poverty. To look at a Thermopolium was to see Rome itself, an empire of spectacle and survival, marble and beans, hierarchy and hunger. Modern parallels remind us how persistent these dynamics are. Today, street food is often stigmatized as low-class, unsafe, or unrefined, yet it remains vital to millions. Elites dine in restaurants, while workers eat at stalls. Migrants bring flavors that enrich cities but also provoke prejudice. Gender shapes perception of who belongs in public dining spaces. Food stalls today still mirror society's divides, just as Thermopolia did 2 millennia ago. The mirror has not cracked, only shifted. Thus, the Thermopolia stand not only as kitchens of Rome's poor, but as symbols of identity. They reflected class divisions, cultural diversity, gender prejudice, religious devotion, and moral anxiety. They were more than places of eating. They were places where Rome revealed itself to itself. In their counters we see not only beans and bread but the essence of society. Who belonged, who was scorned, who survived. In the next chapter, we will deepen this reflection by examining how the Thermopolia themselves evolved through time, how their form, food, and reputation changed from republic to empire, from Italy to provinces. If Chapter 11 has shown us how they mirrored society, Chapter 12 will show us how they changed with it, tracing their evolution as Rome itself transformed. The Thermopolia, like Rome itself, were not static. They evolved, expanded, and adapted as the city shifted from republic to empire, from a modest city on the Tiber to a metropolis commanding the Mediterranean. To understand their evolution is to watch the stalls mirror Rome's transformation, political, economic, and cultural. Their counters tell a story not only of beans and bread, but of centuries of change. In the early Republic, when Rome was still a modest city-state, food stalls were small and informal. Simple vendors sold bread, porridge, and wine from carts or wooden booths. The earliest Thermopolia were likely little more than makeshift counters, catering to soldiers, farmers, and traders passing through markets. Eating outside was common for the poor, but it carried little stigma, for Rome itself was not yet stratified into the extremes of later centuries. As the Republic grew, however, wealth concentrated, villas expanded, and elite dining became spectacle. With this shift, the Thermopolia began to acquire their stigma. They were increasingly seen as the food of the masses, in contrast to aristocratic banquets. By the late Republic, the stalls were firmly established as fixtures of urban life. As grain imports increased and the Annona began to feed Rome's swelling population, the demand for public food outlets grew. Freedmen and entrepreneurs seized the opportunity, building permanent stalls with stone counters and embedded jars. The earliest archaeological examples of Thermopolia date to this period, reflecting a transition from informal vending to permanent establishments. Graffiti from the late Republic mentions taverns and food sellers, confirming their ubiquity. At the same time, elite disdain grew sharper. Cicero and other writers began to equate tavern life with disorder, casting public eating as a symptom of moral decline. The transition from republic to empire marked a turning point. Augustus, eager to stabilize Rome after civil war, reformed the grain dole and secured steady supplies from Egypt. This new reliability allowed Thermopolia to flourish. With 1 million mouths to feed, demand surged and stalls multiplied. Archaeology confirms this expansion. In Pompeii, more than 150 stalls were found, many dating to the early imperial period. Their counters grew more elaborate, faced with marble or plaster, decorated with frescoes. The stalls had become permanent institutions, woven into the very architecture of cities. Under the empire, the Thermopolia also diversified. Some catered to the poorest, offering only beans, bread, and diluted wine. Others targeted freedmen and travelers, providing a wider variety: sausages, fish, honeyed wine. Location mattered. Stalls near baths or amphitheaters attracted crowds with disposable coins, while those in poorer neighborhoods served subsistence fare. This diversity reflects the complexity of Rome's economy. Just as modern cities boast both luxury restaurants and humble carts, so too did Rome's food landscape stratify. Provincial cities replicated the pattern. Excavations in Ostia, Pompeii, and Herculaneum reveal similar stalls. Counters with jars, frescoed walls, traces of food. The Thermopolia were not confined to Rome, but spread across the empire, adapting to local tastes. In Gaul, they may have served stews with Celtic flavors. In the East, lentils and spice dishes. Yet the architecture remained consistent, testifying to a shared cultural form. Wherever Rome expanded, so too did its fast food. Over time, however, their reputation shifted further toward suspicion. As Christianity spread in the later empire, taverns and stalls came under sharper moral scrutiny. Christian writers condemned them as places of drunkenness and sin. The association with gambling, prostitution, and disorder hardened. By the 4th century, bishops discouraged Christians from frequenting taverns, branding them dens of temptation. What had once been necessity became, in moral rhetoric, vice. Yet archaeology shows they persisted. Coins, jars, and counters from later centuries confirm their survival. The gap between moral condemnation and lived reality only widened. The stalls also adapted to crisis. In times of famine or political instability, they shrank, offering fewer goods. In prosperous times, they thrived, decorating counters with frescoes, offering more variety. Their resilience mirrors that of the poor who relied on them. Flexible, adaptive, enduring through turbulence. Just as the empire expanded and contracted, so too did its food stalls. By late antiquity, As Rome declined and populations shrank, the Thermopolia gradually faded. Smaller cities, fewer grain shipments, and changing cultural norms reduced their prominence. Yet the idea of public food outlets did not vanish. Medieval Europe inherited taverns and inns, themselves descendants of Roman stalls. Street food never disappeared, it simply transformed, adapting to new contexts. In this way, the legacy of the Thermopolia survived long after their counters crumbled. Their evolution across centuries reveals profound truths. First, they remind us that ordinary institutions adapt alongside empires. As Rome shifted from republic to empire, as grain flowed from Egypt, as Christianity rose, the Thermopolia evolved. They were not static relics, but living institutions reflecting change. Second, they remind us of resilience. Despite moral scorn, despite famine and fire, they endured. Third, they remind us of continuity. The idea of fast, affordable, communal food is timeless, stretching from Roman counters to modern street stalls. Modern parallels sharpen the picture. Just as today's food trucks adapt to new cities, cuisines, and trends, so too did the Thermopolia adapt to provinces and centuries. Just as governments today regulate food stalls for hygiene or control, so too did Roman emperors regulate grain. Just as elites scorn street food yet secretly enjoy it, so too did Roman elites sneer at, but depend on Thermopolia. Their story is not only Roman, it is human. Thus, the evolution of the Thermopolia mirrors the evolution of Rome itself. From humble beginnings in the Republic, through flourishing in the Empire, through stigma under Christianity, to transformation in late antiquity, they tracked the city's fortunes. Their counters tell a history not of emperors and wars, but of adaptation, survival, and change. They remind us that history is lived not only in palaces and forums, but in kitchens and stalls. In the next chapter, we will look outward, beyond Rome itself, to consider how Thermopolia compared with the food cultures of other civilizations. Were they unique to Rome, or part of a broader human pattern? Chapter 13 will explore parallels in Greece, Egypt, and beyond, situating Rome's stalls in the wider story of street food in history. The Thermopolia were Rome's answer to hunger in a crowded city, but they were not unique. Across the ancient world, civilizations devised their own forms of public dining, each shaped by geography, culture, and necessity. To situate the Thermopolia in history, we must look outward, to Greece, Egypt, the Near East, and even Asia, to see how societies fed their masses. In doing so, we discover that street food is not a Roman oddity, but a universal human adaptation, born of hunger and ingenuity. In Greece, the ancestor of the Thermopolium was the Capelian, the tavern or inn that sold wine and simple meals. Aristophanes, in his comedies, mocked tavern keepers for watering down drinks, just as Roman satirists would later deride their counterparts. These establishments were common in Athens, particularly around the Agora, where merchants, craftsmen, and sailors gathered. Like the Thermopolia, they catered to the poor and transient. Yet Greek culture placed stronger emphasis on the symposium. Elite banquets of wine, song, and philosophy, so public taverns carried even heavier stigma. Still, the principle was the same. For those without wealth, the tavern was survival. Egypt, with its long tradition of urban markets, also nurtured street food culture. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages near the pyramids suggests that vendors sold bread, beer, and fish to laborers. Beer in particular was the Egyptian staple, consumed daily in quantities modern observers would find staggering. In bustling Alexandria under the Ptolemies and later under Rome, food stalls lined markets and harbors, serving bread, lentils, and fried fish. Travelers like Strabo remarked on the abundance of food vendors, confirming that Egypt's masses relied on public food no less than Rome's. The Nile fed the granaries, and the stalls fed the people. In the Near East, Mesopotamian texts hint at taverns serving beer and bread. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to the 18th century BCE, even includes laws regulating tavern keepers, warning them against watering drinks or harboring criminals. These records confirm that public dining spaces existed millennia before Rome, already tied to regulation, stigma, and necessity. The Sumerian goddess Ninkasi, patron of beer, symbolized how deeply public food and drink were woven into life. The tavern was both a place of nourishment and of danger, just as Roman Thermopolia would later be. Farther east, in China, street food traditions were already taking root during the Han Dynasty. Archaeological and textual evidence describes vendors selling noodles, dumplings, and steamed buns in markets. Inns along trade routes provided hot meals for travelers, while urban stalls fed workers. Chinese writers, like their Roman counterparts, sometimes scorned these spaces as vulgar, yet their ubiquity testifies to their importance. The rhythms of Chinese cities, like Rome's, depended on affordable, accessible food for the poor. Even in the Americas, before European contact, parallels existed. The Aztecs of Tenochtitlan boasted vast markets where vendors sold tamales, maize porridge, and cacao drinks. Spanish chroniclers marveled at the variety and scale, noting thousands of vendors feeding tens of thousands daily. Here too, street food was not marginal but central, sustaining an empire's capital through daily commerce. What unites these civilizations is the recurring pattern: dense populations, limited private kitchens, and the need for cheap, fast food gave birth to public stalls. Whether in Athens, Alexandria, Babylon, or Tenochtitlan, the poor relied on these spaces. The foods differed: beans and wine in Rome, beer and bread in Egypt, dumplings in China, tamales in Mexico, but the principle was identical. Hunger in cities demanded public kitchens. Yet Rome's Thermopolia were distinctive in scale and integration. Nowhere else in antiquity do we find such density of stalls preserved, thanks to Pompeii and Herculaneum. Over 150 have been excavated in Pompeii alone, revealing not only food residues but frescoes, counters, and jars intact. These remains allow us to reconstruct Roman fast food with unparalleled clarity. Greece and Egypt had taverns, but few survive so vividly. Rome's stalls thus offer the most tangible evidence of ancient street food, frozen in ash. Rome was also distinctive in stigma. While other societies looked down on taverns, Rome's elites wrote about them obsessively, condemning them as dens of vice. This obsession reflects Rome's class anxieties, sharper than in many other cultures. The Thermopolia were not only kitchens, but cultural battlegrounds, where elites projected fears of disorder. Few other civilizations left such a rich literary record of disdain, suggesting Rome's peculiar unease with its poor. Trade also gave Roman stalls global reach. A bowl of beans in Pompeii might contain grain from Africa, fish sauce from Spain, pepper from India. Few other societies of the time could match this cosmopolitanism. The Thermopolia were microcosms of empire, distilling global networks into local meals. In this sense, they were more than survival. They were tastings of empire itself. Comparisons with modern street food sharpen the continuity. Today, cities from Bangkok to Mexico City teem with vendors feeding millions. Governments regulate them, elites sneer at them, yet they remain indispensable. The Roman Thermopolia were part of this eternal lineage. They remind us that street food is not an innovation of modernity, but a practice as old as urban life. The counters of stone in Pompeii are ancestors of carts and stalls that now line global metropolises. Thus, by looking beyond Rome, we see the Thermopolia as part of a broader human story. Wherever cities grow dense and kitchens shrink, public food appears. Wherever poverty spreads, stalls flourish. Wherever elites dine privately, the masses gather publicly. The foods change, but the principle endures. Rome's contribution was not invention, but scale, density, and preservation. In the next chapter, we will turn from comparison to legacy. How did the Thermopolia influence later European taverns, medieval inns, and eventually the restaurants we know today? If Chapter 13 has shown us that Rome's fast food was part of a universal human pattern, Chapter 14 will show us how that pattern survived, transformed, and continued into the modern age. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE froze Pompeii's Thermopolia in ash, preserving their counters, frescoes, and jars. Yet the stalls themselves did not vanish with Rome's decline. Though the empire fractured, the need for quick, affordable meals endured. The idea of public food, of eating not at home but in spaces of exchange, outlived emperors, religions, and centuries. To trace the echoes of the Thermopolia is to follow a line from Roman beans and bread through medieval taverns, Renaissance inns, and into the modern restaurant. Their form shifted, but their essence remained. Kitchens of the common people, feeding hunger where private hearths could not. In late antiquity, as Rome's population shrank and grain shipments faltered, the Thermopolia waned. Yet taverns and inns continued across the Mediterranean. Christian writers condemned them as dens of sin, echoing Roman moralists, but they persisted. Augustine warned of drunkenness in taverns. Councils issued decrees against gambling and prostitution, yet none could erase them. These establishments catered to travelers, pilgrims, and laborers, audiences too constant to disappear. The Thermopolia survived in spirit, even as their architecture crumbled. By the early Middle Ages, Europe was dotted with taverns and alehouses. These were humbler than Roman stalls, often just rooms in private homes where ale was brewed and bread sold. They served villagers and travelers alike, offering soup, bread, and drink. The stigma remained. Elites derided tavern life as coarse, dangerous, or immoral. Yet, just as in Rome, the poor relied on them. The medieval tavern was the Thermopolium reborn, adjusted to new economies and faiths. In Islamic cities, public kitchens flourished with even greater sophistication. From Baghdad to Cairo, bustling bazaars offered lentil soups, grilled meats, and sweets to laborers and merchants. Travelers like Ibn Battuta described the abundance of street vendors in Cairo, where hot food was available on every corner. These stalls, regulated by guilds, offered more variety than Roman Thermopolia, but the principle was the same: fast, affordable, public meals. Here, the legacy of ancient practices expanded into new cultural forms, feeding empires of faith and trade. The Renaissance brought further transformation. As cities like Florence, Paris, and London swelled, taverns and inns multiplied. Some catered to travelers, offering beds and meals, others to locals, providing ale and simple fare. Records from the 15th century describe taverns selling hot stews, pies, and wine, remarkably similar to Roman offerings. They carried the same reputation for vice, gambling, prostitution, drunkenness, yet remained essential. The Thermopolia lived on in these taverns, their stigma intact, but their necessity unquestioned. The leap to modern restaurants came in the 17th and 18th centuries. In Paris, restoratives, broths sold by vendors, gave the word restaurant its name. By the late 18th century, restaurants offering individual tables, menus, and choice emerged. This was new. Unlike taverns, where meals were communal and fixed, restaurants offered privacy and selection. Yet beneath the innovation lay continuity. Restaurants refined what stalls and taverns had long done: serve prepared food outside the home for a price. The Thermopolia were distant ancestors, their counters transmuted into menus and tables. The Industrial Revolution further expanded this lineage. As cities swelled with workers, demand for quick, cheap meals exploded. Street vendors sold pies in London, pretzels in New York, noodles in Shanghai. Just as in Rome, the poor relied on these stalls because homes were cramped and workdays long. Elite disdain remained. Victorian reformers scolded vendors for filth and immorality, but survival triumphed. The lineage of the Thermopolia pulsed through every pie cart and noodle stall. Today, global street food culture is the clearest echo. From Bangkok's night markets to Mexico City's taco stands, from Istanbul's kebab carts to New York's hot dog vendors, millions eat daily from stalls. The stigma persists. Street food is sometimes seen as unsafe or low class, but so does its indispensability. Like the Roman Thermopolia, modern street food is fast, cheap, flavorful, and social. Counters remain, bowls remain, chatter remains. The forms have changed, but the essence endures. What makes the lineage striking is not only continuity, but memory. Archaeological discoveries at Pompeii have inspired comparisons to modern fast food. Journalists call the stalls ancient takeaways, while tourists marvel at their resemblance to modern cafes. The recognition is intuitive. We see ourselves in them. A bowl of beans served in 79 CE and a bowl of noodles sold today are distant cousins, both answers to the same human needs. The echoes also remind us of resilience. Despite centuries of moral condemnation, public food has never vanished. It has survived empires, religions, and revolutions. The poor have always needed it, and the poor have always found it. The Thermopolia, reborn as taverns, inns, restaurants, and street stalls, testify to humanity's ingenuity in feeding itself against odds. Yet continuity does not erase difference. Modern restaurants emphasize privacy and choice, unlike the communal openness of Roman counters. Modern street food is often celebrated as cultural heritage, while Roman stalls were scorned. And yet, the core remains: public kitchens feeding those without kitchens of their own. The echo is imperfect but unmistakable. Thus, when we trace the arc from Rome to today, we see more than culinary history. We see the persistence of human patterns. Hunger driving innovation, elites scorning the practices of the poor, communities gathering around food. The Thermopolia are not relics of a lost world, but ancestors of ours. Their counters live on in every street vendor, their jars in every pot of soup simmering for strangers. In the next chapter, we will return one last time to the ruins themselves, to Pompeii and Herculaneum, where the Thermopolia remain frozen in ash. Chapter 15 will take us into the archaeological rediscovery of these stalls, the moment when the world first realized that Romans, like us, once lined up at counters for fast food. For centuries, the Thermopolia were little more than footnotes in the writings of Roman satirists and moralists. Seneca's sneers, Juvenal's mockery, Martial's jibes. These were our only clues, casting the stalls as smoky dens of vice. No one knew what they truly looked like. No one could smell their stews, see their frescoes, or run a hand along their counters. Then, in 1748, shovels struck the buried city of Pompeii, and history was reborn. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, which destroyed the city in fire and ash, had also preserved it with eerie perfection. Among the villas and temples, archaeologists found something unexpected: fast food stalls, intact, their counters and jars frozen in time. Pompeii revealed more than 150 Thermopolia scattered across its streets. Each was a snapshot of daily life, preserved as if the cook had stepped out only moments before disaster struck. Counters of volcanic stone lined with marble, jars, dolia still embedded, frescoes painted with food and animals, all lay waiting. Unlike Rome itself, where centuries of building had erased evidence, Pompeii was a time capsule. Suddenly, the vague taverns of Juvenal had faces, colors, and smells. The most spectacular discovery came in 2020, when archaeologists unearthed an almost complete thermopolium in Regio V of Pompeii. Its counter was brightly painted with images of a rooster, a guard dog on a leash, amphorae, and even mythological scenes. Analysis of residues in its jars revealed duck bones, piglets, fish, and snails, evidence of the diverse menu. Traces of beans and wine completed the picture. For the first time, we could reconstruct not only what the stalls looked like, but what they served. It was a revelation. Roman fast food had variety, flavor, and visual flair. The humble stalls mocked by elites turned out to be colorful, practical, and creative. Other discoveries reinforced the vibrancy of these spaces. Graffiti scratched into walls near stalls recorded jokes, boasts, and even advertising. One inscription read, "Best wine here, for 1 coin. Better wine, for 2. Falernian for 4. Others mocked rivals or bragged of dice games. These voices humanized the stalls, reminding us that they were not abstractions but lived spaces, full of chatter and laughter. Archaeology gave back to the Thermopolia the voices elite literature had tried to silence. The placement of stalls in Pompeii revealed their social role. They clustered along busy streets like the Via dell'Abbondanza, near the Forum, baths, and amphitheater. They served both daily hunger and leisure, feeding workers and spectators alike. Some were modest, with a single counter, others more elaborate, with multiple frescoes and larger spaces. Together, they formed the backbone of Pompeii's food economy, testifying to the city's dependence on public kitchens. Archaeological science added even more detail. Analysis of residues in jars showed mixtures of grains, beans, and fish sauce, garum, confirming literary accounts of Roman tastes. Carbonized bread loaves, found in bakeries and stalls, showed how meals were paired. Isotope analysis of bones revealed the diets of animals served, linking local husbandry to stall menus. Even micro-remains of herbs hinted at flavoring. Coriander, dill, and fennel. What had once been sneered at as coarse now emerged as complex, adaptive, and flavorful. The rediscovery of the Thermopolia changed how historians viewed Roman life. For centuries, history had been written from the top down. Emperors, senators, generals. The poor appeared only as mobs, faceless and hungry. Pompey's stalls gave them shape. We could see where they ate, what they ate, even the art they looked at while eating. The counters of the Thermopolia brought the everyday into history, reminding scholars that civilizations are not only marble temples, but stone counters, not only conquests, but meals. The impact extended beyond scholarship. To the public, the Thermopolia became among the most beloved features of Pompeii. Visitors marveled at their similarity to modern fast food. Journalists dubbed them ancient takeaways, comparing them to cafes and food trucks. The connection was intuitive. Bowls of beans served over counters 2 millennia ago felt instantly familiar. The Thermopolia became bridges across time, dissolving centuries in the shared experience of eating quickly and cheaply in public. The rediscovery also challenged prejudice. For so long, elites had defined the stalls as vulgar. Archaeology showed otherwise. The stalls were vibrant, decorated, practical, and essential. They were not dens of vice, but lifelines of survival. They were not shameful, but creative. In exposing this truth, archaeology restored dignity to the poor of Rome, revealing their resilience and ingenuity. The stalls were no longer symbols of moral decline, but of human adaptation. Pompeii and Herculaneum are not the only sources. In Ostia, Rome's harbor city, excavations have uncovered similar counters. Across the empire, fragments of taverns and food stalls emerge, though less well preserved. Together, they confirm that the Thermopolia were not provincial oddities, but empire-wide institutions. Yet Pompeii remains unique for its detail, its colors, its jars still half filled with food. Nowhere else can we stand at a counter where a Roman once stood, bowl in hand, waiting for stew. The rediscovery of the Thermopolia also reshaped how we view continuity. Street food is not an invention of modernity, but an ancient practice. The counters of Pompeii are ancestors of today's food stalls. In their frescoes and jars we see echoes of signs and menus. In their beans and wine we see echoes of soups and snacks. The line from Thermopolia to food trucks is not metaphor, but genealogy. Thus, archaeology gave back to the Thermopolia their rightful place in history. No longer dismissed as dens of vice, they became symbols of resilience, creativity, and continuity. They remind us that history is not only emperors, but cooks, not only senators, but stall keepers, not only marble, but beans. They are history's humblest ruins, yet also its most human. In the next and final step, we will draw the saga together. The conclusion will reflect on what the Thermopolia teach us, not only about Rome, but about ourselves. For in their jars lies not only food, but philosophy, a reminder that civilizations survive not on grandeur, but on bowls of soup shared in community. Across 15 chapters, we have followed the trail of the Roman Thermopolia from their humble counters to their rediscovery in ash. We have seen them as kitchens of the poor, stages of community, targets of scorn, partners of spectacle, and nodes of empire's economy. We have compared them with food cultures across civilizations, traced their echoes through time, and finally stood before their frescoed counters in Pompeii. What, then, do they teach us? First, they remind us that history is lived from the bottom up as well as the top down. The chronicles of Rome are filled with emperors, senators, generals, and wars. Yet for every Caesar or Cicero, there were millions of ordinary Romans who never entered a Senate chamber or banquet hall. They lived in insulae, crowded into narrow rooms, dependent on public food. Their lives rarely appear in written sources, but the Thermopolia preserve their presence. In the jars of beans, the graffiti on walls, the traces of wine, we glimpse their daily reality. The stalls restore dignity to the forgotten, reminding us that civilization rests as much on cooks and customers as on conquerors. Second, They reveal the deep entanglement of food and politics. Rome's emperors ruled not only through armies and laws, but through grain. The annona, the grain dole, was the lifeline of the capital. When grain shipments faltered, riots erupted. The Thermopolia stood at the fault line of this system, where imperial policy met daily hunger. They were barometers of empire. Full jars meant stability, empty jars meant unrest. In their counters, we see how fragile power can be and how easily politics collapses into hunger. Third, they illustrate the paradox of stigma and necessity. Elites sneered at the stalls, branding them vulgar dens of vice. Yet the city could not survive without them. They were scorned and indispensable, mocked and essential. This paradox is not confined to Rome. Across time, street food has carried stigma associated with poverty, dirt, or disorder, yet it has remained vital. The Thermopolia remind us to question whose voices define morality and whose labor sustains society. Fourth, they demonstrate continuity. From Athens to Cairo, from Han China to Aztec Mexico, from medieval taverns to modern food trucks, the same pattern recurs: dense populations, limited kitchens, and the ingenuity of public food. The Roman Thermopolia were part of this universal story. When we buy noodles from a cart, tacos from a stand, or soup from a vendor, we continue rituals thousands of years old. History lives not only in monuments, but in bowls. Finally, they invite humility. Rome prided itself on marble forums, triumphal arches, and aqueducts. Yet the empire's survival depended on beans simmering in clay jars. Grandeur and fragility coexisted. The Thermopolia remind us that civilizations are sustained not only by power, but by daily acts of feeding and being fed. The simplest bowl of food may matter more to survival than the grandest temple. The rediscovery of these stalls in Pompeii has given us more than ruins. It has given us mirrors. When we look at their counters, we see not only ancient Rome, but ourselves. We see our own street stalls, our own fast food, our own mingling of hunger, community, and stigma. We recognize that the need for quick, affordable, communal food is timeless. The faces at those counters 2,000 years ago are not so distant from ours. In the end, the Thermopolia teach us that history is human. It is the warmth of soup on a cold day, the chatter of neighbors leaning on counters, the clink of coins passed across stone. It is survival and solidarity, prejudice and pride. Rome lives not only in marble ruins, but in these bowls of memory. Bowls that continue to echo in every street stall across the world.